I still remember that frost-filled February morning when I visited the store on Wentworth Avenue, chock-filled with Lunar New Year decorations, and where I met an elderly Chinese woman. I was in Chinatown for dumplings and decorations. She reminded me so much of my own mother, who had immigrated to the United States in the 1950s. We started to converse, and I said, 恭喜发财, which is how Chinese people wish one another Happy New Year, which is actually, I hope you get rich. And we began to talk in Mandarin, my first language. I asked her how long she had worked at the store, and I learned that she was the owner and she had lived in Chicago for over 20 years. She asked me where I worked, and I said, downtown Chicago, across from Millennium Park. And then she said something that has stayed with me until now. She asked, what is downtown Chicago like? Because she had never been to what I call downtown Chicago. This led to a difficult realization about segregated Chicago, a city celebrated as one of neighborhoods, and also a difficult realization about myself and my ability to move fluidly across boundaries and barriers, which is a right that I exercise in a way that many cannot. This woman had created her entire life and home around a neighborhood that I often frequented, but only to enjoy food and culture. In July 2021, Illinois became the first state in our nation to require the inclusion of Asian American history in public school curriculums. Too many Americans, and I include myself in this group, know too little about Asian American history, which is American history. Knowledge of Asians doesn't extend far beyond tasty pork buns or beef and broccoli, and grappling with the dim sum menu provides instant gratification, unlike grappling with our government's role in passing the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act that barred Chinese immigration and prohibited Chinese from becoming American citizens. This law created a profound gender imbalance and stopped the growth of the Chinese American community in Chicago. In 1910, there were 65 Chinese women and 1,713 Chinese men. This delayed the growth of the second generation of Chinese Americans and contributed to this idea that Chinese were strange and foreign to many Chicagoans. After being recruited to do the backbreaking work of building the transcontinental railroad in the 1850s, American labor organizations began depicting Chinese workers as effeminate and weak. In 1908, Samuel Gompers, a hero of the American Federation of Labor, released a racist and well-received treatise entitled Meat versus Rice, American Manhood Against Asiatic Cooleyhood. He grounded his xenophobia and also his anti-Asian sentiments in a culinary idiom, you are what you eat. He depicted white workers as hardy meat eaters and reliable versus Chinese workers as weak, watery rice eaters. This contributed to pushing Chinese workers into professions normally considered women's work, like cleaning and cooking, which is one of the historical reasons we have so many Chinese laundries and Chinese restaurants in the United States. By the way, there is a park on the north side of Chicago with a monument celebrating Samuel Gompers and all of his accomplishments. Despite all of these obstacles, the Chinese in Chicago built a vibrant community center and organizations for mutual aid and mutual support in a Chinatown that is now 30 blocks big and 400 businesses strong. Due to a racialized history, most Americans think of segregation as the imposed segregation between Black and white Americans. Government policies like redlining and racial covenants prevented too many African Americans from their self-determination and deferred their dreams of where they could work, live, and build a home. But there are also spaces of self-segregation for all people of color. These are places of empowerment, of safety, of collective joy, where people could choose to be themselves with people who looked like themselves without fear and without recrimination. These are spaces that have had a long-lasting impact on every aspect of U.S. life, from the music that we dance to the food that we eat, to the art that we view, to the way that our cities look and feel. These are places of comfort that can be understood as sites of resistance against homogenization and against the push to act more American, which too often is code to eat and to perform and to act white. Recent data from the Public Research Institute shows that most people of color openly admit to choosing self-segregation for certain activities. Although for 75% of us, we have social circles and work circles that are racially diverse. On the other hand, 75% of white Americans have social circles that are entirely white, although they say they do not choose to self-segregate. How to make sense of this? There is a willingness to celebrate difference in the United States. This is often embraced as the notion of multiculturalism, which is not the same as fighting and ending racism. For me, this meant that during the Lunar New Year, I was always invited to my children's classroom and to civic groups to share my traditions and to make dumplings. This opportunity to celebrate my cultural identity never included an invitation to talk about racial injustice. I was never invited to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act or Asian American hate crimes. Multiculturalism and celebrating difference does not allow for an exploration of how Asians as a group have been often given privileges over brown and black people. And our eventual acceptance as the so-called model minority roped us into being surrogates for white supremacy. How do we actually reconcile the desire for a city, a beautiful city of diverse tastes and textures that expands all of our lives, with imposed segregation that limits the freedoms of some? Currently, I work at the National Public Housing Museum with public housing residents to build a cultural institution on the near west side of Chicago in the last remaining building of the Jane Addams homes. The museum fights for the right of all people to a place to call home, and it is a call to our nation to have a much more inclusive foundation for the stories that we interpret, preserve, and share. We link arts, culture, and public policy in order for us to hold one another and each other and the city accountable to these histories. And through these efforts, we bring people across divides in order to build and imagine a more collective and just future for all of us. When we see and experience a neighborhood, really see it, let's not just make it about the food and culture that we consume or the differences that we can celebrate. Whether it is the art and murals in Pilsen, or the jazz and blues venues in Bronzeville, or places where you can get a beautiful round mooncake, a flaky pastry filled with sweet and salty egg yolk to celebrate the Lunar New Year. Let our enjoyment of these places be a catalyst for curiosity about the history of these places and a curiosity of the stories of the people, and a commitment to asking critical questions about how things came to be. And let this inform our collective efforts to ensure that all of these places have the same freedoms and access to public education, public safety, public health, economic opportunities, and housing. That way, we can all have our mooncake and eat it too.